In section 9.6, we're going to learn how to use the quadratic formula in order to solve any quadratic equation. So remember, a quadratic equation is an equation with the highest power of 2. So the quadratic formula is given ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So you have to make sure your equation is set equal to 0, and then you just have to have your quadratic equation in standard form. The quadratic formula is x equals, so again, we're using the quadratic formula to solve for x. So x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, so 4 times a times c, all over 2a. There is a song you can sing with this in order to remember what the quadratic formula is. And it's in the tune of Pop Goes the Weasel. So it goes da 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 da. So here's how it goes. X equals negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. We'll sing this a lot in class, and you're going to make fun of me, but truly that is how most people remember the quadratic formula. And so this is something else I want to make sure you write down on top of writing out what the quadratic formula is. Make sure you write down that this method, the quadratic formula, can be used to solve any quadratic equation. We have seen lots of ways to solve quadratic equations, but this method will work every time. So let's look at our first example. So here's example number 1, part A. It says solve 2x squared plus 7x equals 9. So we're going to use the quadratic formula, but remember your equation has to be set equal to 0. So we're going to subtract that 9 over, so we get 2x squared plus 7x minus 9 equals 0. So let's first identify our a, b, and c values. So a would be 2, the number in front of x squared. B would be 7, the number in front of x, and c is our constant term, which is negative 9. So we'll use the quadratic formula. X equals negative b, so the opposite of your b term, so in this case is negative 7, plus or minus the square root, draw that in first, b squared, so 7 squared minus 4, that's just part of the quadratic formula, times a, which is 2, times c, which is negative 9, all over 2 times your a value. So what I want you to do first is simplify, figure out what is underneath your square root. So remember, you need to do the square, the exponent first, and multiply this out, and the last thing you're going to do is subtract. So we would have negative 7 plus or minus the square root of 49, which is 7 squared, minus 4 times 2 times negative 9. So think of this as negative 4. So negative 4 times 2 is negative 8. Negative 8 times negative 9 is positive 72. And then let's just go ahead and multiply this out. So it'd be 4 on the bottom. So continuing to simplify this, we'd have negative 7 plus or minus 49 plus 72. That is 121. So we have the square root of 121 divided by 4. So let's continue simplifying this. The square root of 21 is 11, so we would have negative 7 plus or minus 11 over 4. So you're going to get two answers. The first answer you're going to get is by taking negative 7 plus 11 divided by 4. The second answer will be negative 7 minus 11 divided by 4. So again, our first answer, negative 7 plus 11 would be 4, and 4 divided by 4 is 1. Then we're going to do the minus route, so negative 7 minus 11 is negative 18 over 4. So I have negative 18 over 4, and lowest terms would be negative 9 over 2. So we're just going to leave it as a fraction in lowest terms. So there's our two answers. We know that if it's a quadratic equation, the most number of answers that we can get is 2. So it makes sense that we get the two answers. Remember, you can either get two answers, one answer, or no answer. So here's example number 1, part B. 3x squared minus 1 equals x. So remember, we need to put it in standard form and set it equal to 0. So it'd be 3x squared, and I'm going to have to move this x. So it becomes negative x on the other side, and I want to put that in between the 3x squared and the minus 1 so that I have it as ax squared plus bx plus c. And again, we set it equal to 0. So this time, a equals 3, b equals -1, and c equals -1. So let's use the quadratic formula. X equals negative b, so it's the opposite of b, so we're going to do 1 plus or minus the square root of b squared, so we need to make sure it's -1 squared, minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2a, which is 3. So remember, simplify what's inside of here first. So -1 squared is 1, so I have 1 plus or minus 1, and then we'll figure out what this is. Think of this as -4 times 3, so that's -12 times the -1, so we have plus 12 all over 6. Next, we just continue simplifying, so 1 plus 12 is 13, so we'd have 1 plus or minus the square root of 13. This isn't going to work out as nicely as it did last time, where we had a perfect square. The square root of 121 was 11. 13 is not a perfect square, so we're just going to have to use our calculators. So in your calculator, you would type in 1 plus the square root of 13, hit enter, and then divide by 6 to get your first answer. And then the second answer, you do 1 minus the square root of 13, hit enter, and then say divided by 6 to get your two answers. So you would end up with approximately 0.77 as your first answer, and that was found by doing 1 plus the square root of 13. And my second answer would be approximately -0.43. So your two x-intercepts would have been these two numbers, because remember, solving a quadratic equation is the same thing as finding x-intercepts. So one more time, these would be my final answers. So this is alleviating us the task of factoring or completing the square or graphing to find x-intercepts. We can just use the quadratic formula in order to solve for x from now on, and this method will work every single time. And example number 1, part C, x squared minus 8x plus 16 equals 0. So you can notice here that our equation is in standard form and set equal to 0. So our a value is 1, b value is -8, and the c value is 16. So remember, I have all these options now. I can factor, I can complete the square, I can solve, I could just use square roots if it didn't have an x term, or now we can use the quadratic formula. It's however you want to solve the problem. So let's just use the quadratic formula. So we have x equals -b, which is the opposite of your b term, so in this case it's going to be 8, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so -8 squared, minus 4 times a times c, all over 2 times a. So again, simplify what's under here first. So -8 squared is 64, so I would have 8 plus or minus the square root of 64, and then I'm going to take -4 times 1, which is -4, times 16, which is -64, divided by 2. 64 minus 64 is 0, and the square root of 0 is 0, so all I end up with, like this goes away, and all I have now is 8 over 2 as my final answer. So 8 divided by 2 is 4, so I have one answer, and that is x equals 4. So what this means is, if I had a parabola, the vertex would have been right at x equals 4 on the x-axis. So remember, you can have two answers, or one answer, or no answers, like we saw in the section where we were graphing quadratic equations to solve it. So again, if you end up with one answer, that just means that is your vertex on the x-axis, and that's okay to get one answer. In the cases where you'll end up with no solution, what will happen is when you do the square root part, you'll end up with a negative number underneath the square root. And remember, you cannot take the square root of a negative number, so therefore your answer would be no solution. So again, write this down. You will end up with no solution if you end up with a negative underneath your square root in the quadratic formula. So no solution when you end up with a negative underneath here. One solution if these end up canceling each other out and you get the square root of 0. Let's look at a story problem now. It says, for the period of 1990 to 2003, the number of book titles published by a small publishing company can be modeled by the function y equals 0.5 squared plus 4x plus 19, where x is the number of years since 1990. In what year did the company publish 80 books? So if it's 80 books, that is your Y value. The number of books published is your Y value. X is the number of years since 1990. So what they're saying is when Y equals 80, what did X equal? So let's put 80 in for Y. So we'd have 80 equals 0.5x squared plus 4x plus 19. Now remember, if we're going to use the quadratic formula to solve for x, we need to set the equation equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract 80 from both sides. So I end up with 0 equals 0.5x squared plus 4x minus 61. So my a value will be 0.5, my b value is 4, and my c value is negative 61. And those are the numbers that I'm going to put into the quadratic formula. So I have x equals negative b, so negative 4, plus or minus b squared, so 4 squared, minus 4 times a times c, all over 2 times a. So again, as always, simplify what's underneath the square root first. So 4 squared is 16. So far I have negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 16, and then negative 4 times a half would be negative 2, and then negative 2 times negative 61 would be positive 122. And then half of 2 is 1, so we would just have 1 on the bottom. So now we have negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 138. So we're really not going to need to divide by 1, so I'm just going to leave it as that. So we'll find our two answers by taking negative 4 plus the square root of 138 and negative 4 minus the square root of 138 to get about 7.7 and about negative 15.7. But remember, x is the number of years since 1990, so x is the number of years. It doesn't make sense to have a negative number, so we'll throw out the negative 15.7. But our question was, in what year did the company publish 80 books? So it was 7.7 years after 1990, so we would say 1997, almost 1998, since it was 7.7. So again, closer to 1998 than 1997, but it was in the year of 1997 that they published 80 books. To wrap up this section, we have a concept summary, the methods for solving quadratic equations. We actually have 5 ways now. The first way was by factoring. That's what we saw in chapter 8. You're going to use it when a quadratic equation can easily be factored. You'll graph it when you can approximate the solutions and it's adequate to do that. It's okay if we have approximate solutions. You'll use square roots when all it is x squared equals some number, so there would not be an x term in there. You'll complete the square when any quadratic equation is in the form of this, but it is simplest to apply when a equals 1 and b is an even number, because remember, you're going to divide by 2 and square it. So I would use completing the square when you don't have an a term and the b value is an even number, since you have to divide by 2. And remember, our last way is the quadratic formula, and you can use it all the time. That's it for this section. Make sure you jot down anything you didn't understand that we can cover in class before we move on, and we'll see you then.